All right, so welcome. It's great to see you all here. I'm Prof. Nichols. I'm a historian here at Oregon State University. I'm also the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I also help to lead our Citizenship and Crisis Initiative, of which this is a part. The initiative is co-sponsored by the OSU School of History, Philosophy, and Religion and the Center for the Humanities, and it asks questions like, what is a citizen? How has citizenship changed over time? Should we jettison the concept of citizenship entirely? And in what ways have crises, such as war or economic downturn, impacted understandings as well as practices of citizenship? These and related questions frame our multi-year interdisciplinary initiative program on citizenship and crisis, which is organized around the sort of enduring questions about citizenship and crisis and the relationship of the two. Our theme this year is democracy. It's a good one. Might be our theme for quite a while. There's several University of Oregon programs going on about democracy and democracy under stress, so clearly that's in the air these days. And our wide-ranging inquiry here at OSU involves panels, town halls, visiting speakers like our great speakers here today, C-SPAN and NPR events, programming across Oregon, across the Northwest and beyond. And it focuses on a wide array of questions, not just limited to questions of citizenship, but other ways that we can think about democracy in the US and abroad, and there's substantive international components to this. Essentially, our program is one of engaged democracy, and what's most important about that is that we're bringing the best insights from across the humanities to bear on contemporary questions, and we're bringing deep thinking about these issues without any inherent polemical position, but rather trying to prompt really important kinds of conversations, maybe now more important than ever. So now I have the great pleasure of moving on to a few of the logistical elements of introductions, then frame out what our format is, say a few brief remarks about the topic, and jump into introducing our speakers. So first off, as I always say, please silence your phones. I continue to be shocked at faculty meetings, in classes, in community activism, and all across how often phones go off, including by people who should know better, senior administrators at this university included. All right, you have to depart early. I know a few people are going to need to go a little bit early. Feel free to do so. Just do so as quietly as possible and sneak on out. Remember the sign-ins. You can sign in at the end if you didn't get a chance to sign in now. Feel free to move up to the front if some seats open up. Now, on format, I'll try to finish my introduction remarks as fast as I can. What each of the speakers will do is aim to provide one set of kind of provocative remarks, roughly 12 minutes, no more than 15 minutes, or I'll hook them off, intended to promote deep thought on one or two kinds of issues related to this topic. We can't do justice to the breadth and depth of this topic, even in 2 hours, 4 hours a day. So we'll try to prompt you guys to think more deeply about a few different issues that our specialists are pondering themselves, or their recent work has engaged. And then we want to have a conversation with you all. So the goal is as much discursive and community and engagement as it is about sort of positions from on high being projected out. All right, now turning to our panel and some final thanks. Thanks to our Citizenship and Crisis lead intern, Tessa Barone, who's in back. She's doing a great job helping us get everything working properly. Thanks to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, especially Director Nichols on Kermidden. To CLA, College of Liberal Arts Dean Larry Rogers, who's also very supportive of our programming, and to Natalia Bueno, our Public Relations and Information rep, who makes everything run smoothly. I'd also like to add that for those of you who are interested in this topic who are students here, one of the things we've been trying to do more of is integrate our public programs with our coursework and our curriculum. So if you didn't get one of these, maybe take a look. We've selected out just 4 classes that might interest you if you want to build on your interest in this class. They range from a course on modern Latin America, where questions of surveillance have been important, to a question on pacifism, a class on pacifism, just war, and terrorism, where obviously issues of surveillance, privacy, national security are issues, and an introduction to disability studies class, right, to think about this in another way, about ableism and a range of aspects of the interdisciplinary field of disability studies, and then another course that we yanked out and thought might interest some of you on great figures in philosophy. So it's worth thinking about these topics, not just here in this kind of setting, but also in a more sustained setting in class. All right, having said all that, let me start with a few remarks about the topic. One of the ways that we began to think about this now almost a year ago was when Professor Reeves I met Professor Reeves and we were talking about surveillance and his book that recently came out on the subject. And we were sort of joking, we're all being watched. This is in our promotional material. We're all being tracked. We're all being recorded virtually all the time. So where did this come from? How did we arrive at this moment? What have we lost? What have we gained from living in a world like this? Are we all sort of just data? This is a question that Professor Koopman talks about. Where are we being surveilled? This is a question that Professor Sutherland talks about, right? In the workplace, at home, in all walks of life. President Trump, for example, still hasn't appointed someone to protect US elections from cyber attacks. It's been the so-called National Protection and Programs Directorate, I went to a meeting about this in January, remains leaderless 10 months after Trump suggested that cybersecurity was one of his top issues. Current politics and cries about leakers, about whistleblowers that cast this as a question of patriots versus treasonous figures, right? As if there's only these two binary positions in a world of leaking and not leaking, right? Are the sorts of rhetorical positions that some of the scholars in this panel can engage with and that you all are probably interested in. What counts as classified? How do we live in a world where record numbers of documents are classified and record numbers of documents are turned down for Freedom of Information Act transparency issues, right? This is the most classified that the world has ever been, at least the US has ever been. How did we arrive at this point? And indeed, you know, I would argue, and I'd love to hear what you all have to say here in the audience and the panel, that the politics of surveillance, our literal title for the panel, is as much or more about politics than it is about anything else. That in fact, the politics of surveillance is about politics. It's not about national security fundamentally. It's not about positions of keeping us safe, for example, which is the rhetoric that accompanies the politics of surveillance. And so I encourage us all to think a little bit about that set of questions as well. So it's clear, though, that new technologies are driving this, new understandings of individual rights, of corporate rights, of collective rights, of national security. They've dramatically shifted in recent years. Hello, welcome. Come on in if you want to. New threats also seem to abound everywhere, right? One of the reasons I think we're all interested in this topic is that from individuals to collective groups, it seems like there are more threats than ever in terms of the surveillance landscape, whether it's to protect people from threat or threats that seem to impose something on our personal lives. These sorts of changes seem seismic, that in fact they seem to have shifted the very landscape on which we walk, the ground on which we move, and it may seem like all of this is new. I hope our panel will address this question of newness, because it seems to me as a historian, questions of change over time and their significance are very important. You know, would you all say that current technologies of surveillance are really a product of the late 20th century or the 21st century? Would you like to say that this is something fundamentally different in human history, in human relations, in society? Or, if we point back to the historical record, it seems to me clear, as one scholar has put it, spying and surveillance are as old as civilization, right? This is something that human beings have seemed to have engaged in as far back as we have a written record. So what do we do with that fact? It seems fundamentally different, new, urgent, pressing, and yet it's old. Age is old. Older than all of us, maybe older than the written record. Recent public debates and discussions about surveillance, which literally comes from the French to watch over, right? So it's worth us thinking about that, the watch over component of surveil, have centered on two main issues, at least it seems to me, and I think our panel may disagree a bit. Security and privacy. These include the revelations that started about 2010, cables that were leaked to WikiLeaks, then 2013 and 2014, revelations about the National Security Agency, the NSA, some of their programs like PRISM, Edward Snowden's leaks, Chelsea Manning's leaks, the rise of WikiLeaks. Is that a great democratic component of world transparency, or is it in fact something more insidious, or can it be both simultaneously? This also includes Russian hacking and Russian proxies hacking into elections and influencing the 2016 presidential election, but also buying Facebook ads. We could go on and on about these elements that intersect with surveillance, propaganda, privacy rights, security questions. That's probably why many of you are here today. And then we've also had American politicians accusing the CIA, the FBI, the NSA of surveilling them, right? So politicians themselves, Dianne Feinstein's the most famous example of this, that the CIA was watching her and getting her in trouble. Then these sorts of cover-ups and debates over them are crucial to thinking about framing out some of these issues that we'll be going through today. According to a number of Pew Research Center polls that I also often cite when I talk about the subject, most Americans are skeptical that there's anything the US government can do in terms of changing surveillance. They think that the revelations of the past few years actually, quote, will increase the ways in which they are surveilled. That they worry that national security imperatives, quote, have overridden domestic protections, and Americans, in poll after poll, lament the lack of, quote, adequate limits on the government's data collection. They don't always lament, but they sometimes lament when it's pointed out, the corporate data collection that's going on. So I think we'll be talking about some here too, right? So it's not just the government that's surveilling us. In some ways, Big Brother is more corporate than state-centered. During the Obama administration, as I suggested, record numbers of documents were censored and rejected for Freedom of Information Act requests. And a turn to the historical dimensions, I think, will help us see more here. That's why our panel is past, present, and future. As I've argued elsewhere, and I won't go on too much, I think a lot of this starts with World War I. We can talk more about that in our Q&A. But a very short history would be something like 100 years ago, the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918 were passed. These acts censored speech, they curtailed what could be said, they curtailed the ability to dissent, they curtailed what could be written and distributed, they empowered the Postmaster General, the police, and what became the Federal Bureau of Investigation to look into everybody's stuff and to decide what they could say. And in fact, the Supreme Court wound up saying that that was not an abridgment of free speech. And this also empowered people like the young, intrepid lawyer, J. Edgar Hoover, who pushed this agenda with the FBI for generations in terms of overseeing what could be said and done, and through lots of operations that surveilled American citizens. Why is this also significant? It's the Espionage Act for which Americans have been tried for whistleblowing and leaking. So if you're thinking about this set of questions, the crucial issue is that many of these happened most recently under the Obama administration. But you had figures like Victor Berger, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers, Manning, Snowden, and others tried under this World War I era act, right? So this is the mechanism by which we get curtailments of freedom of speech and several other ways in which this is operated. I could go on about that history, but I want to get to our panelists. So the rest of that would be something like this. Over the course of the next century, after 1917 and 1918, Americans were committed to a vision, often, of transparency and governance. And yet, because of these sorts of acts, and because of the exigencies of conflicts, wars, depressions, and other urgent efforts, the urgent moments that seem to push back against civil liberties, you continue to have surveillance at the government level. What seems somewhat different is the ways in which corporate surveillance and corporate dataization of individual information has become a commodity. And this is something that Professor Koopman talks about when he terms the rise of what he terms the rise of infopolitics. That gradually, this is also something Edward Snowden has talked about, the sort of hacktivists have tried to worry about and expose how we live in an era of byte and bitization, that we've been chopped up into our meaningful data, but we're no longer sort of biopolitics citizens. Our bodies aren't as important. These philosophers can address this better than I can. But that this information represents us in almost every way. And this is the sort of stuff that surveillance is all about in the present, in a way that it fundamentally wasn't, say in 1918 and 1917, when someone like five-time socialist candidate for president Eugene Debs was put in jail for speaking out against the draft. That seems very different from everything that Facebook knows about us. And yet, it's in line with this longer tradition. And we really have very little sense of how fully our digital selves are monitored by public agencies, by agents, by corporate entities, or by tech-savvy individuals, or by foreign powers who want to exploit that information. We don't really know that much about where we're being surveilled, in the workplace, at home, in the interstices between those two, if we can even sort that out. Or what our roles as responsible citizens should be. How should we as citizens deal with this? How should we as non-citizens deal with this? How can we advocate on behalf of others in a world and a landscape of surveillance? Which provides me, I think, with a perfect question to transition to our first speaker. Joshua Reeves is a assistant professor in the School of Arts and Communication here at Oregon State University in the College of Liberal Arts. He'll be talking about what he terms see something, say something, citizen spies and social responsibility. His first book, Citizen Spies, The Long Rise of America's Surveillance Society, was released earlier this year by New York University Press. And he's an associate editor at Surveillance and Society. His most recent work has appeared in journals like Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, Critical Studies in Media Communication, and Television and New Media. With his colleague Jeremy Packer at the University of Toronto, he recently completed another book manuscript on media technologies and automation in the US military. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Reeves.
Thank you, Chris. And of course, Colin and Gretchen for coming up from Eugene. We really appreciate y'all being here, especially everyone in this room. Thanks for coming out. Since we'll be addressing this panel partially to the question of citizenship and crisis, I wanted to emphasize at the outset the relationship, the historical relationship, something that's been going on a long time, between citizenship in the United States and citizens carrying out surveillance. So encouraging people to watch their neighbors in the name of being good citizens and doing their responsibility for the state. So there are a number of ways in which this has been carried out, and as Chris pointed out, I published a book earlier this year on the longer historical issues that Chris is worried about. You know, is this a new thing, or is this something that's been going on for a while? I think in many ways it's been going on for a while. But today I want to focus on a couple of newer campaigns. So let's check this out. Seeing something and saying something for cash. Okay, so that's where we are right now. Here's a program that's going on in Philadelphia. It's called Push Out the Pusher, Report Drug Activity, Rewards up to $5,000. Okay, so in Philadelphia, the police department will marshal financial resources to have you narc out people, perhaps your neighbors or someone you see on the corner that perhaps seems like they are dealing drugs, and they will give you cash rewards for that. So they're not just using good citizenship as a way to get you to spy and snitch on your peers, but what they're doing is actually giving you cash rewards to do that. So, you know, that's an interesting line that hasn't been crossed a whole lot, but it's something that we're seeing more and more often. Here's another one, that's Stop It Solutions, and they work a lot with corporations and businesses. They work in high schools, they work in colleges, and what this does is it allows anonymous reporting and incident management, and sometimes that is tied in certain high schools, especially with small cash rewards for snitching on your peers, for having contraband, or for doing things that they shouldn't be doing according to the rules of the school. So this is particularly, there are many ways to look at this, but in a lot of ways, giving rewards for spying and snitching on your peers, for seeing something and saying something, is, I think, a troubling direction that we want to keep in mind. I want to focus on other things while keeping this in the back of our brains throughout this talk. So what I'm going to discuss today, I'm going to give you a quick conceptual overview. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the theory of this, but I want us to understand the larger overarching conceptual issues with this problem. I will look quickly at counterterrorism programs, but again, this is a lot bigger than the If You See Something, Say Something program. This is a lot bigger than the Department of Homeland Security, as Chris was pointing out. This has a larger history, and it has its webs into a lot of other private and public programs as well. And then I'll give you some parting thoughts and perhaps provoke some thoughts for Q&A later. So the basics, and this is sort of a conceptual overview. These programs, like If You See Something, Say Something, which is the DHS program that I'm sure we're all familiar with. If you've ever been in a transportation center, if you've ever been to the airport, you know, obviously, about If You See Something, Say Something. So these programs facilitate new understandings of civic duty based on moral entrepreneurism, in that they trade civic gratification or cash rewards, as we're starting to see now, for spying or for tattling on your peers. All right, we see this often with public programs that are run through the Department of Homeland Security or local police departments, but we also see these with these private institutions that are pushing us to watch our peers so that they can monitor them at work, or they can manage their conduct no matter where they happen to be. So this is a public and a private issue. These programs, they also illustrate a signature form of liberal social control. Okay. Instead of coercion or force, instead of directly applying pressure to change people's behavior, what they do instead is they enlist citizens to voluntarily, you have to choose to do this, to voluntarily monitor and manage their own behavior and that of their peers. Okay, so it's directly opposed to a more totalitarian form of social control. If you envision the soft hand of liberal government encouraging you in various soft ways to do things that they want you to do, I think this is a form of that. It's getting us to spy on our peers and to regulate their conduct in these ways. So that's how I'm going to approach this today, as this, again, sort of a liberal style of population management, is having citizens participate in their own. Control is sort of a hard word there, but that's we'll move forward with it anyway. He said to be provocative, so why not? Yeah. So, local and federal U.S. authorities receive between 8,000 and 10,000 anti-terrorism tips a day, every day. That's about 1 every 10 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the United States. Okay, so let's digest that for a second. Local and federal U.S. authorities receive between 8,000 and 10,000 anti-terrorism tips a day, every day. Okay, so let's think about that. Now, depending on what you consider to be a terrorist attack, we haven't had that many, right? I mean, terrorism is obviously a tough issue, but citizens being encouraged to look at their peers as potential terrorists brings you a situation where they are more and more inclined to view the people around them and the activities that they see as being indicative of terrorism. And so this 8 and 10,000 anti-terrorism tips a day. Okay, so it's an extraordinary figure. It proves that we are growing perhaps more suspicious. We are more ready to view our peers and their behaviors as signifying something nefarious. Okay, and that's a social issue that I think that we need to tackle as well. So that's something that, again, to provoke thought, as Chris pushed us to do. So, continuing with this theme, I want to give you an idea of what certain people viewed as suspicious. And not only did they view this as suspicious, but they viewed it as being suspicious enough to, in Los Angeles and other places in California, actually report these activities to authorities, which then collect them and then analyze them and try to produce some kind of counter-terrorist intelligence. So these went to the LA field office. They filled a lot of these reports from all across California. We have female subject taking photos of Folsom office. Okay? Taking photos. All right? That's obviously an indication of terrorism, right? Suspicious males buy several large pallets of water. All right? Now that's pretty threatening. Okay? Subject taking photographs of a bridge crossing the American River bike trail. Okay, that's terrifying. All right? The words tax government were spray painted at the Sacramento International Airport. Okay? So, given the climate of suspicion that these programs have helped generate, these are the kinds of activities that our peers sometimes view through the lens of potential terrorism. Okay? So, this is just a sampling. I mean, I could go on for hours and hours and hours because, again, we have thousands of these to go through a day. And most of them are like this. I mean, occasionally you get nuggets of potential intelligence, but most of the stuff that they have to sift through is this, okay? People buying pallets of water and somebody spray painting, tax government, okay? So, another thing that we have to think about as well, again, he said be provocative, so be provocative. Is this a pressure cooker or is it a weapon of mass destruction? Well, this is a question that hit home to a Michigan college student named Talal Al-Ruki. He walked through his apartment complex and he had a pressure cooker filled with rice. All right? And then the following day, his house was raided by federal authorities, counterterrorism authorities. He had a dozen agents in his apartment because this was directly following the Boston Marathon bombing, where something like this was actually used. But these serious, intense terrorist events tend to jog the imagination of people such that we get alarmed about these things. And so you have an ever-growing number of activities and everyday objects that come to potentially signify terrorist activity. So this poor guy just having a pressure cooker, again, incited enough suspicion to where he had several, not just one, several people inside his apartment complex assume that he was planning to carry out a terrorist attack. And then that the authorities took that seriously enough to actually come by his apartment and check that out. So again, this is something that we have to keep our minds aware of So, because it has tremendous, I think, political and social implications, that we have this growing idea of what can potentially signify terrorism. Now, parting thoughts. The programs that try to recruit us to, in order to squelch terrorism, to keep an eye on our peers, that if you see something, say something program, and other programs in the private and public world, what I think is we see a conflation of good citizenship with spying and snitching on our neighbors. And again, I don't think this is something that's quite unique to the post 9/11 world, but it is something that we see having interesting implications now that we have the proliferation of objects that can be considered to be terrorist devices. Cars are now seen as, potentially being bombs. Pressure cookers could potentially be bombs. I mean, everything is now seen as a threat, and everybody is now potentially seen as a threat, especially since the Oklahoma City bombing. And so I think that this is something that has opened up and has caused a proliferation of the objects and potential persons who can signify a danger to us. So we have a conflation, therefore, of good citizenship with spying and snitching, where you have public and private authorities trying to get us to keep an eye on one another so that we can prevent these things from happening. We encounter this cultivation of suspicion everywhere. And I mean, here's some of the things that I go over in the book. Neighborhood watch is an important one, at least I think. DARE programs, which I think most people in this room went through from the time when we were younger. America's Most Wanted is another way that people crowdsource responsibility for crime fighting and potentially terrorism as well. And even 911 emergency. Okay, so when you have the emergence of 911 emergency, it changed in interesting ways, I think, the way that citizens had to view themselves as being seen, saying citizens. If you see a crime, then you would call the cops. And again, he said to be provocative. I have some ideas in the book. I won't talk about them here, about the Kitty Genovese case. So if you want to talk about that, we can go over that in Q&A. In any case, to conclude, I think media technologies, I'm a media scholar, and so this is my primary interest. They allow the state and allied authorities from the corporate world to capture our social responsibility in a lot of ways, and then transform that into civic responsibility. When we can call the cops, or when we can use an app on our phones in order to report suspicious deeds or the misdeeds of our peers, then in a lot of ways it has allowed the state to mediate our social responsibility. It puts the state right in the middle of it, so that instead of dealing with issues directly with one another, we now have a phone number to call that puts the state right in the middle of our social responsibility, thereby transforming it into civic responsibility. And that's a larger argument, but it's something that I want to leave you with. And the telephone reroutes our social responsibility through the police department. Okay, and so especially with programs like 911, we are taught from the time we were very young to see something and say something. That is a demand of our good citizenship. So let's think about the ways in which we've been taught to see something and say something, and what are the potential political and social implications of that. Okay, so again, thank you all, and thanks especially to my fellow panelists.
Way to follow instructions, be provocative, and be timely. I love it. Get a media scholar in to do all that. All right, so next up, we've got from just down the road in Eugene, Gretchen Soderlund. She's Associate Professor of Media History in the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. She'll be presenting on command control technologies and workplace surveillance, so kind of at the intersection of several topics we've already touched on. She's the author of Sex Trafficking Scandal and the Transformation of Journalism, 1885 to 1917, from the University of Chicago Press. Her work on media history, gender, sexuality, and technology has appeared in such journals as Feminist Formations, the Communication Review, Humanity, Critical Studies in Media Communication, Sexuality Research, and Social Policy Studies. She's got several new articles coming out just next month, in fact, I was excited to learn about. Futures of Journalism Past, or Past of Journalism Future, like that title, in a special issue of Boundary 2.0, and The Conspiratorial Mode in American Television, Politics, Public Relations, and Journalism in House of Cards and Scandal, which will appear in the next issue of the American Quarterly. And her next book project is, interestingly, a memoir, which I'm interested to hear more about. So please help me in welcoming Professor Soderlund.
Thank Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this great panel, and thanks to all of you for coming. I think you are probably going to have to time me because I fear that even though this project, what I'm presenting today, isn't a small piece of a book project, it's something that I've just started working on. I'm afraid that I prepared too much. So you'll have to time me. Oh great, I've already got this on, and let me just make sure that I can, okay. I don't know if I'll get a chance. I had a short video that I'm 20 seconds that I might show you, but in the interest of time, I might have to skip it. So in this talk, I'm going to be discussing surveillance, technology, and labor. But I'm not going to focus on surveillance labor in the way that we tend to understand it. That is as what media scholar Richard Maxwell describes as, quote, the continual observation of an individual or group of individuals or group of people for wages. Surveillance workers, for Maxwell, are employees who utilize visual or acoustic technologies to observe, filter, monitor, or subdue populations. Examples would include prison guards, detectives, TSA personnel, even the hired hands, right, who are paid to watch and code reams of police dash cam footage in search of narratively compelling footage for reality shows like Cops, right? They would be considered surveillance workers. And surveillance technologies in this sense would include X-rays, millimeter wave units, drones, surveillance cameras, or even this new facial recognition system that the Dubai airport is rolling out, that you may have read about in the last couple of days, that scans travelers' facial features and their irises as they pass through a visually rich virtual aquarium tunnel. A green "have a nice trip" light flashes at the end of the tunnel if you're cleared, but the system will trip off a red light that will in turn alert security personnel if you're deemed a risk after moving through this tunnel. But rather than discuss this type of surveillance technology today, I want to focus on hybridized command control systems that are increasingly common in today's workplaces. And since I live with someone who works in an emergency room, I'm going to use electronic medical records as my central example of a command control technology. It's not one you would typically think of, but I'll explain to you why it is one. And so later in the talk, I'm going to share his account of the difficult and often cumbersome transition from paper charting to electronic medical records in hospital emergency departments. I interviewed him 2 nights ago. By command control technologies, I mean highly integrated, hybridized systems that are multimodal. That is, they don't just surveil, and in fact, surveillance might not even be their primary function. They also chart, track, map, quantify, report, model, gatekeep, and perform a dizzying number of other functions. These systems don't just extend the senses, they actually integrate information involving multiple senses, and they heighten the cognitive capacity of actors in a range of organizations and workplaces. They organize workplace and other activities with their real-time monitoring. And it's important to note that not all surveillance technologies are command control technologies, but all command control systems incorporate surveillance as one of their functions. So some examples of command control technologies as I'm using it would be systems in retail, right, that integrate cash registers, inventories, and worker performance. Those are command control technologies. So is web-based organizational software in manufacturing, right, that combines acquisition, the buying and selling of raw materials and parts, the manufacturing of products, employee performance, and sales all into one system. So they're these highly integrated systems that penetrate the organization. Command control is a military concept that refers to the coordination and direction of efforts toward a single goal, that of accomplishing a mission. When we think of command control, the image of a military leader commanding heavy weaponry or the movement of troops comes to mind. But the military actually uses command control in an organizational sense. Command control is an instrumental organizational concept that, according to one recent Department of Defense publication, does not require unity of command, so it doesn't require that one individual is in charge, unity of intent, but there must be some overlapping goals among the actors involved, and it doesn't involve explicit control. So command control technologies facilitate command and control. They're integrated systems that are highly instrumental and purpose-based. Command control technologies were once available only to the military, I'll move on to this slide, only to the military and large-scale computing systems, but now you can find them even among small workplace teams of less than 20 people with laptops and server-based technology. They perform, or at least they're seen to perform, a very clear function in organizations, that of reducing waste and efficiently and strategically achieving certain institutional ends. In the military, you see them all over in the military and law enforcement and in border control. And what these systems do is they allow for a mission accomplished style real-time tracking. The fantasy being that that enemies of the state, criminals, or border crossers won't be able to slip through the fine mesh of informatics that's being used to catch them. And I have an example here. Interestingly, as I was looking for examples, I found this company that is called Command Control Technologies. And here's an example of the multimodal nature of command control technologies. Let's see. Oops. How do you want to open this? Do I want to use just Google Chrome? Okay. So here's Command and Control Technologies Corporation. And here, the Department of Homeland Security contracts with them as for part of their in their border patrol efforts. And you can see they list down here some of the capabilities of this system. So the key capabilities of their border control system, it's customizable, but these are some of the things it can do. It can engage in real-time multi-sensor acquisition, advanced surveillance analytics, threat characterization, advisory and response, targeting and auto-tracking support. It provides a common operating picture, and so forth. Mobile agent command. Let me go back. Let me get out of this. Whoops. Oh, where do I? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, so that's just an example of one of many of these systems. But they take different features depending on the organizational goals, right? So as I mentioned before, surveillance is rolled into these cybernetically integrated command control systems. The systems can render visible or detectable remote events, or it can filter and screen data. They can also create visual, narrative, and quantitative records for later scrutiny, legal action, storytelling, crime detection, border policing, job performance evaluation, bill collecting, or analysis. But as Raymond Williams reminds us, the capacity of most technologies exceeds their stated or their intended uses. And this is doubly true of command control technologies. So just as the act of surfing the web guarantees that your movements are also being tracked and analyzed, command control technologies contain this recursive feedback element as well. Their operators become the objects of surveillance. As they use technology, their actions are charted, mapped, and analyzed their behaviors monitored, their efficiency gauged. Command control technologies are instrumental technologies, but they're also the conduits for imagining and attempting to promote various social realities. Administrators, in particular, tout the efficiencies of these systems and espouse their ability to quantify behaviors and detect misbehaviors. And belief, and this is critical, belief and trust are necessary components in these technologies. In particular, workers must trust in them and administrators believe in them. Command control technologies reshuffle and change the division of labor when they're introduced into a workplace. And the incorporation of electronic medical records into hospitals provides an excellent example of how this happens. So before electronic charting, physicians and nurses used paper charts, or what are called T-sheets, that were templated. So if you went into the emergency room, for instance, and you had a patient complaining of abdominal pain, the physician or the nurse would grab the abdominal pain chart and they'd check off boxes. There was no need to narratively describe the patient. There was also a template for pelvic pain, there was a template for orthopedic injuries, and so forth. But over the last decade, hospitals have rolled out these very costly electronic medical record systems so that patient charts are digitized and so that they're accessible within and throughout hospital systems. Before electronic medical records, patient charts required extensive clerical staff. And the idea was that as these electronic systems were rolled out, hospitals could downsize the clerical staff and increase efficiency, save money, and so forth. Now, it can cost a hospital about $50 or $60 million to install a system like one is called Epic, it's Care Connect, and it's the gold standard in electronic medical records, even though it's kind of a shabby system. If you're digitizing the records of a regional network of hospitals, say 5 or 6 hospitals, the cost is closer to $200 million. And it's also very labor intensive. It takes months and months when you're rolling out these systems before you get to what's called go live day. And go live day is the day that the hospital transitions from paper to electronic records. And it's always a day that's met with, there's lots of celebration. I'll describe it in a little bit. But electronic charts, they make a lot of sense, right? They're less cumbersome than paper. They don't entail shelving. They don't entail files. They're accessible throughout the hospital, as long with privacy protocols in place, of course. But as with all command control technologies, their actual uses exceed their promoted functions. Electronic charting it's the way doctors and nurses enter information about a patient's health, just like with T-sheets, but the systems also become the way they do many other things, or some would say the way they do everything. So once a system is installed, you can't order a lab, you can't administer medication, you can't give a respiratory treatment, you can't order x-rays or CT scans, you can't give a patient that's bleeding profusely blood unless you've entered it into the system. And so in the emergency room, that means scurrying back and forth between a patient's room and a computer in order to get a critically ill patient the care that they need. Nothing happens until it's entered into the system. And there's actually a lockdown system in place so that medication won't be released until it goes through Epic's Care Connect. And the video, I was going to show you a little video, but if you search Epic Go Live Day, you'll find all of these videos of doctors and nurses dancing around and singing songs about how great Epic is going to be and throwing paper in the air. We're getting rid of paper, and throwing bills, fake money in the air, because the idea is that this is going to also make a lot of money for the hospital. So for this talk, I interviewed the aforementioned emergency medicine doctor about his experiences with Epic. Now, Epic is the 3rd or 4th computer system that he's used, and he's experienced 2 of these go live days in two different hospitals. At his prior hospital, on go live day, they were playing rock ballads in the cafeteria and giving out free food. Balloons were hanging in the hallways, and people were wearing celebratory caps and t-shirts. There were administrators in suits roaming the halls as if they actually worked there, the physician recounted. Incidentally, Go Live Day was also the first and last time he ever saw these people who commanded the highest salaries at his institution. But in the emergency room and on the floors, chaos and fear reigned supreme. He said that, quote, "The switch from paper to electronic was a brutal revolution involving near-death experiences for patients and summary firings of nurses and other employees accused of using the system in the wrong way. A whole security staff was employed to watch the medical staff and nurses, and if a nurse or another staff member was looked at the wrong chart, they could be fired. As this physician put it, quote, a whole class of people who knew nothing about medicine appeared and began lording their power over the medical staff by enacting seemingly random acts of retribution against those perceived as violating privacy while doing little to help us practice medicine and save lives. And on one Go Live day, there was actually a glitch in the system and blood would not be released from the blood bank. And at one point, the doctors and nurses were talking about taking a crowbar and actually going and trying to open up the blood bank that way. So in a real emergency, there are very little you're stuck, right? There's nothing you can do unless you go to this system. And that's what I mean by command control, right? It thoroughly penetrates the system. So Epic, this medical electronic charting system, was touted as a labor-saving device, but in the end, it actually required more labor. It required a huge IT staff, and also the introduction of an early medieval technology, the scribe. Because physicians need their hands free, they can't write these long, complex narratives that the system requires. And so now they hire scribes in hospitals who are usually, people, pre-med students or people training to become physician's assistants to serve in this capacity and to follow them around. I guess I only have about 30 seconds, so I will close by saying what does this tell us about command control technologies? It tells us that they simultaneously expand and transform labor and its capabilities. They bypass and supplant certain forms of labor, but all these attempts to get rid of labor lead to greater labor demands in another part of the institution. And in some cases, the extensive productivity of command control technologies can be disabling. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. That reminded me of the intersection of Equifax's data breach and medical information data breaches. And if you think about questions of who is surveilling what and what you've voluntarily given up to, say, a medical institution and where that information can then be taken and used, it's another interesting way to think about the sort of bit and bitization of us as human beings and how that transformation then has implications far away from, say, one emergency room visit or something along those lines, which is exactly the sort of thing I think that Koopman will be talking about when he addresses how we became our data, info, power, and dataveillance. Colin Koopman is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director of New Media and Culture at the University of Oregon. His published work has appeared in journals ranging from Critical Inquiry and Diacritics to the Journal of the History of Philosophy and Foucault Studies. He's published 2 books on philosophical methodology, and is at work on a 3rd book, tentatively titled How We Became Our Data, a genealogy of the informational person. You might also have read, I believe, a New York Times op-ed that he wrote, the first piece of his work that I recall, on this exact question of info power and info politics. His new book situates the current social media and surveillance society moments in a longer history of the formation of informational subjectivity dating back to a crucial period in the early 20th century. Might it be the World War I era, the Gilded Age and Progressive era? I hope so. We'll find out. Please help me in welcoming Professor Griffin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be up here in Corvallis. Always love my visits to OSU. And thanks to Josh and Chris for inviting us up here. Very happy to be here. Very interesting talk so far. I've been furiously scribbling notes. Chris mentioned that I'm a philosopher by trade. I'm in a philosophy department. So that means that I'm obsessed with theoretical questions because that's how you get into the gates of philosophy. That said, I'm committed to forms of philosophy that run those theoretical obsessions through contemporary and historical realities. And I'm going to be talking about some of the contemporary and historical realities of surveillance today, but always in the background of that for me are sort of theoretical questions that I get through a range of different philosophical figures in the history of philosophy, but primarily Michel Foucault, who some of you will have heard of, some of you will have not. That's fine, I presume no prior obsession with Foucault, or even with philosophy. So let me just get my screen full here, and all right. So I'm going to talk about, offer kind of a quick overview of a chapter in progress from a book in progress. The book is tentatively titled How We Became Our Data. I think I'll be done with it by the end of this year, and it may be out in a year or two. The central focus of the book, even if it never makes the light of day, is this, info politics, by which I just plainly mean politics of information. A politics of information is a politics of and for informational persons. Who are informational persons? Well, we all are. We have all become our data. This is, as it were, the provocation of my project. In some senses, I intend it as a provocation. We've all become our data, but in another sense, I really intend it as a very flat-footed, obvious statement with which I hope you will not disagree, because I mean this in the sense of now we have become just our data, but we have become, rather, our data also. Okay? So we're no longer just bodies, minds, souls, whatever we always have been, but we're also our data too. We live through our data. That's the point I want to make. And I want to ask, in the broader project, what made that possible? What made it possible for people to be increasingly made by their data? So one set of answers, or one set of thoughts you might have here has to do with surveillance, the topic of the panel. When I think surveillance, I can't help but think of it through the work of Michel Foucault, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Foucault, French philosopher, 1926 to 1984, perhaps most famous for this book, Discipline and Punish, kind of a history of the emergence of the prison as a ubiquitous system of punishment in modern societies. We didn't always have prisons. How did it come to be that now, when somebody commits certain kinds of crimes, everybody thinks, well, we ought to send them to prison, right? That's the question Foucault is asking in that book. Part of his answer has to do with what he calls discipline, disciplining, and normalization. So he's interested in a form of disciplinary surveillance by which prisoners, but also students, and really the citizenry at large, learn to normalize their behavior or make themselves conform to normal standards of behavior. Kind of the exemplary technology of that for Foucault in this book, for those who have read it, is this, the panopticon. This is basically, the panopticon is an architecture for a prison, and it's an architecture such that you have a central guard tower in the middle and cells arranged in circular fashion around the guard tower. The guard tower can see into the cells. And this was designed in such a way that it was theoretically conceptualized, and some of the panopticons that were actually built it didn't matter if there was actually a guard in the tower, and that's crucial for Foucault's point, because what for Foucault is important is that the prisoners know that they might be being watched. And that really captured the dynamics of surveillance in modern society. Not that we are being watched, but that we know we might be being watched. And so we learn to regulate or discipline our behavior in light of the fact that there may be surveillance cameras in this room, right? That this might be being recorded, you might be being recorded in certain ways, things might be being recorded on your phones right now. So surveillance operates in that way, not the actual fact of recording, but rather the actual possibility of being recorded, and that you know that. So, surveillance would be one sort of part of the story of infopolitics, how we became increasingly made by our data. I want to offer a sort of a take or a twist on surveillance in terms of what a number of scholars are increasingly talking about under the rubric of dataveillance. I think it's an interesting question about how surveillance and dataveillance relate to one another. I'm not going to get into that, but that's I think something that we should maybe talk about during the panel. But unlike surveillance that works primarily through disciplining and normalization, dataveillance, I want to argue, works primarily through formatting and fastening. So data formats us, and it fastens us. It formats us, or it works on us through the ubiquitous formats that we find throughout our lives. And what those formats do is they fasten us. And fastening here I mean in the kind of technical sense, though it is obviously an everyday word, and I like to draw on the double sense of that everyday word. So when you fasten something, you both tie it down, you pin it down, you button it up, but you also quicken it, you speed it up, right? So we get fastened by data, we get tied to these formats, but these formats also amplify the velocity of interaction that we can have with banks across the country, banks across the ocean, etc. So dataveillance formats us and fastens us in contrast to surveillance that disciplines us to be normal. Now, when you hear the word dataveillance, and in the literature, many people think of something like this. This is how scholars will typically describe it. Something kind of high-tech. This is just sort of meant to be a stand-in image for something high-tech, people being monitored in a high-tech kind of way. And that's true. That's definitely part of it. But I want to add a historical perspective to this high-techness. I want to ask, what were the seemingly innocent design decisions that were made in the past such that it would become possible for us to be data veiled today, such that it would be possible for there to even be a terrain of political inequalities of data today? What seemingly innocent design decisions in the past condition contemporary politics of data? So I have kind of two images to represent this. This is an image not of the latest mainframe computer or cloud storage technology. Obviously, rather, it's an image of card files. This is taken at the Candler Building in 1936, which was the first year of operations of the Social Security Board, now Social Security Administration. And this is basically the ops room of the Social Security Board. These were the card files. This is card files for the wage records of American workers. When Social Security was implemented, it took a period of 6 months from November of 1936 to early 1937 for Social Security to enumerate 90% of eligible American workers. So 90% of millions were enumerated in 6 months from 1936 to 1937. This at the time was called the biggest bookkeeping job in the world, and they pulled it off in 6 months. Okay, it's extremely impressive, especially if you set it next to this technology. This is a standard certificate of birth from 1931 in the state of Mississippi. It took 3 decades for birth registration boosters from 1903 to 1933 to achieve 90% registration of newborns across the United States. So you have 90% of enumeration of American workers in 6 months, 1936, and leading up to that, it takes 30 years to get a similar level of registration of infants. They're not exactly analogous cases, obviously, but I think there's something interesting here in terms of a 60 manifold decrease in the amount of time that it takes to register and enumerate. So, birth certificates, I think, are interesting because they're historically situated at this progressive era moment in which we begin to get data conditioning subjectivity, in which data begins to format who we are. And birth certificates emblematize that for me. And let me offer, say a few more things about birth certificates here. So they're interesting not only because of their historical location, but they're also interesting because they are what information technologists of identity today will call breeder documents. Birth certificates are the documents from which are bred all of the other identity documents that we have, at least in the US legal policy context. So birth certificates were and are, they remain a critical piece of technological infrastructure for today's informational persons. They function as conditions of possibility for much of our contemporary apparatus of informational subjectivity. It's really, think about it this way, it's the one piece of paper you really don't want to lose. You can lose all the other stuff, driver's license, passport, etc. You really do not want to lose your or your child's birth certificate. So birth certificates not only represent our entry into the oxygenated world outside of our mother's wombs, but they also represent our first point of entry into information technology systems that today function as the oxygen we breathe for so much of what we do in the world. So I want to sort of analyze this in the bigger book project through philosophical genealogy, which again I borrow from Michel Foucault. This is a tree, quick and dirty metaphor for genealogy, in part because I think the sort of common sense family tree sense of genealogy is not all that far from philosophical genealogy, though we can discuss that, and I wrote a whole book nitpicking that, so it's something I'd love to discuss, but let's just run with family tree for now. There are a bunch of trees. Imagine this is a sort of rhizomatic tree structure. These are aspen trees, which are rhizomes, so they all kind of share a common root structure. They're really the same organism. And there's a whole multiplicity of ways in which informational personhood sprouts and grows and branches over the years. There's psychometrics, for instance, intelligence tests, personality tests. There's the datafication of race. If you've read anything about redlining projects over the past few years, ways in which race gets turned into data in this period, the 20s and 30s. Project after project of datafication of subjectivity. But I'm interested primarily for today in documentary identity. So in terms of the genealogy of the birth certificate, 1903 to 1933, very quick and dirty version of this might run as follows, is that up top you have the top of the tree, you have the visible surface. You have things that are obviously going on to people in this period of time. You have the development or proliferation of new knowledges or sciences, new moves, new kinds of epidemiology, demography, new paralegal practices, and you have knowledges of individuals expressed in files and file systems. You have new kinds of political forces operative in this period of time. You have birth registration campaigns, new forms of legislation are made possible. Once you get birth certificates, it becomes possible to have something like child labor legislation. You can't prevent people from working until they're 15, until you've got a reliable technology for proving that somebody's 15 or 16 or however old, right? And you've got, again, these are all, everything up top here, this is like very visible to historical actors in the 20s and 30s. You've got new kinds of persons in the world. You've got registered babies. You've got eligible child laborers. You've got now people who can demonstrate that they legally hold title in certain ways because they've demonstrated descent, right? So they own this property. And thinking forward to Social Security, you now have people who can demonstrate eligibility for benefits. So that's the sort of surface. That's what's going on the surface. Genealogy is interested in what goes on down below. I'm interested in the introduction of information into the infrastructures of personhood, not just in sort of ordinary, highly visible sense that we have with these things up above, but really kind of deeper shifts. And how is power itself operated? How is knowledge itself conceived or construed? How is it possible for persons to become subjects? What new kinds of subjectivity, what new, to use Foucault's term, modes of subjectivation come into being in this period of time as part of this process of change? And those roots would connect then These like structures of informational persons, info power, info politics, that would connect what I'm talking about in terms of birth certificates to things like intelligence testing, datafication of race, universal language projects, etc. So there's this depth level where they all connect. And I'll very quickly just run through this and then leave you with this. What really interests me, though, are the techniques in virtue of which these depth level knowledges, powers, and modes of subjectivity get expressed in things that are visible and obvious to everyone in that milieu. And by techniques, I'm thinking of a sort of complex of concepts, affects, and technologies. And above all, I'm thinking of technologies of the birth certificate from 1903 to 1933. I won't go into detail because I see that I'm running over on time here. But you have the introduction in this period of things like standard forms, standard filing protocols. This is Standard Certificate of Birth from 1916. Just the standardization of this. That did not exist if you go back before 1903. It was not the case that everybody would have a birth certificate that was standardized in the same kind of way, right, nationally. Then, of course, you need standard filing protocols for maintaining this. So you get paper record systems like this. And crucially, there develops in this period a project of data auditing, in virtue of which birth registration boosters, people at the Census Bureau, people at other government bureaus can make sure that the data that they have is reliable, or at least set metrics for reliability such that they can claim to know what they're doing when they're boosting birth registration. So there's a chart of adequacy or inadequacy of birth registration laws in various states according to metrics and audits that people in that period were developing. So I'll leave it at that, getting a little short there.